best podcast, the Heidelberg.
The third benefit of the doctrine of providence is a good, quiet, and tranquil heart, a gentle spirit, with which a Christian henceforth expects everything from God's hand to be for the good. For since our lives are surrounded by countless dangers that daily threaten us with death, our hearts will be rid of all anxiety, fear, and worry when the light of God's providence penetrates them by the grace of the Holy Spirit.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or its advertisers. Listener discretion is advised. Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And now, Scott Clark.
Scott is very kind. Yes.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
I'm going to say two words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully.
Stop it!
Well, we can't. We're just getting started, but thanks for the invitation. It's the Heidelcast, the podcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This episode is for the week beginning Sunday, December 22nd, 2024. And we're brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. We exist to recover the Reformed confession and to help others discover it. We're at heidelbergrefformationassociation.org. Email or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net.
Leave your name and message. I'll get back to you.
Call or text the Heidelphone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Don't forget to subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. And give us a 5-star rating in your pod app so that others can find the Heidelcast.
Apple Podcast comments.
Leave a comment and we may read it on the show.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
Oh, thank you for the cowbell. We really need more cowbell.
The Heidelcast.
This is part 17 of our series,
The Comfort of the Covenant.
And we've compiled a resource page at heidelblog.net/comfort for the whole series. It has a bibliography, a list of Heidelblog resources, and all the episodes for the series. It's also linked to the show notes of each of the shows in the series. And as always, you can find everything you need at heidelcast.org. Last week, you and I looked at questions 31 through 38 of Caspar Olevianus' Firm Foundation. And we're thinking about what does it mean to say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. That's the first article of faith of the Apostles' Creed, for sure, but also the Rule of Faith, which predates the Apostles' Creed, at least the mature form of the Apostles' Creed, by about 200 years. So very ancient indeed. So early 2nd century, we were saying this. And this week, we're looking at questions 39 through 43, the benefits of the biblical doctrine of providence. One of the things that marks out Reformed teaching, whether it is in Europe, wherever you might, whatever language group you might be looking at, German, Dutch, French, right? Swiss, which are either French or German speaking, right? So wherever you're looking, and until the Polish churches became infected with Unitarianism, you found sound Orthodox churches in Poland and in Hungary, so all across Europe. And then in the British Isles, you'll always find them talking about a couple of things. One, here's the doctrine. They'll present that. And then they will present uses, typically, then often benefits. And my guide, Caspar Olevianus, who lived from 1536 to 1587, was a contributor to the Heidelberg Catechism and a relatively important early Reformed covenant theologian. And one of the things that I like about what he does is that he will give the doctrine and he will give some history and he'll give some biblical support for it. And then he does the use, right, like a good Reformed guy. So, by the way, one of the reasons why I'm not crazy about people talking about the Puritans as if they were some unique, distinct entity is that they weren't doing anything that the rest of the Reformed weren't doing. In other words, whether you're looking at European texts, which tend to be, at least the texts that I look at, tend to be in Latin. This text is in German originally, but translated into English. they're all doing the same thing in basically the same way. So when I wrote my book on Caspar Olevianus, Caspar Olevian and the Substance of the Covenant, the Double Benefit of Christ, which remarkably, thanks to the good offices of the people at Reformation Heritage Books, is still in print. I argued that he was a German Puritan. And I argued that intentionally because I don't think there's any huge difference between the European Reformed and the British Reformed. If you look at the Dutch Reformed in the middle of the 17th century, they are all the theological and spiritual children and grandchildren of William Perkins through William Ames, obviously, who come from England. So that theology, piety, and practice was transmitted to the Netherlands and from there to other places. So the whole business, the whole taxonomy, the way we divide up the Reformed by sort of ethno-linguistic groups, and sometimes people imply that there's something unique or special about what's happening in the British Isles, just really doesn't seem to be the case. And it wasn't even their consciousness. If you read them, they are reading the Europeans, and they don't think that they're doing anything that isn't being done on the continent as well. Anyway, one of the things that I like that Olevianus does is that not only does he talk about the uses of a doctrine, but he often talks about the benefits of the doctrine. And that's what we're doing this week, is thinking about the benefits. Right? What good is it? How does it help us? How does it benefit us? How does it bless us to have a firm grasp of the doctrine of providence? And he starts on that in question 39, where he says, explain the various parts of the benefit believers receive from their knowledge of God's providence. And he says there are three benefits in particular. The first is thankfulness when things go well for us. Everything that goes well for us and happens the way we like, we should ascribe to God and thank Him for it, whether we experience His goodness through people or His help through other created things. So the thing here we want to get is that God sovereignly superintends all things. So when things happen the way we want them to happen, so he says when things go well for us, we should ascribe to God and accredit these things to God and thank Him for it. And then he says whether we experience His goodness through people or His help through other created things. I think that's kind of important. One of the things that distinguishes Reformed theology, I think, to a certain degree, or maybe Reformation theology, from other kinds of theologies that have developed, particularly since the Anabaptist movement in the 16th century, and they pre-existed that movement in the Middle Ages and even in the patristic period. But in our time, we see it in the Anabaptist movement. We see it in Pietism. We see it in the higher life movements of the 19th century, the holiness movement, to a large degree in the Pentecostal and charismatic movement, and in other mystical movements. And that is a turning away from secondary causes or means. And that's going to be a theme in today's episode, that God operates ordinarily through created things. And that makes American evangelicals a little nervous because they don't feel like it's real religion and real Christianity, apostolic Christianity, unless it comes, a blessing, let's say, comes directly from God and is not mediated through any created instrument, whether it be a person or some other created thing. It doesn't seem real to them. And that's why, people are always trying to recreate the apostolic church as they imagine it. So when people practice the so-called gifts, which is, for example, glossolalia, not actually an apostolic gift, as I keep telling you, as I've tried to show you in the series on feathers and all, glossolalia is a universal religious phenomenon, and it doesn't have anything to do with what happened in the book of Acts or in 1 Corinthians or what happened in the apostolic church. It's another thing altogether. There's nothing in the book of Acts about being slain in the Spirit, and people simply don't have apostolic gifts today. I'm not saying God doesn't do marvelous things. He does. He's free to do all kinds of things, and He does all kinds of things. But I am saying that there are no Apostle Pauls or Apostle Peters or Apostle Johns, and people don't have the apostolic gift of healing, and they aren't ordinarily, as far as I know, raising people from the dead. And if they are, I'd sure like to see the empirical evidence for that. Lots of claims about these things, but remarkably, in 2024, when everybody has a 4K camera in their pocket, we don't have any high-def video of people actually raising other people from the dead, at least not that I've seen. So, if they could produce this kind of evidence, and if my Pentecostal friends could, as I'm talking to you right now, I'm actually struggling with an illness. So it'd be great if one of you guys could come over here and heal me the way one of the apostles did. But typically you don't. And I prayed with you, some of you guys. So it's not like I haven't, been in the midst of this. I laid hands on a fellow one time with some powerfully, spirit-empowered Pentecostal charismatic guys. And we were not able to heal this fellow on whom we laid hands, because none of us were apostles. Anyway, that's a whole other series. So go listen to that series. But in Reformation theology, and I think this is in line with a lot of the history of the church, we've always recognized that God typically operates through secondary means and causes. And that you hear that in Olevianus' language, that it's not unspiritual to think that God will use physicians, that God will use pharmacists, that God will use other healthcare providers, or if we're not even talking about health, just whatever it is we're talking about, God uses secondary means, right? That's the way that God has set up the world and the way that He operates. It's even, and of course we're doing a whole series on this on Saturdays, God has established what we confess as the due use of ordinary means. How does He ordinarily bring people to new life and true faith? Does He just strike them like a bolt out of the blue? I mean, there are a lot of people who would like to see that, and a lot of people who talk about Christianity as if that's the way God ordinarily operates, but that's not what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 10. And on the basis of Romans 10, we confess in Heidelberg 65 that God ordinarily brings His elect to new life and true faith through the preaching of the Holy Gospel and strengthens that faith through the use of the Holy Sacraments. So that's Reformation theology. And that's different from a lot of contemporary, modern, late modern, American and Western and maybe even global evangelical theology, piety, and practice, which is all about the extraordinary, all about the supernatural. Right? It's very supernatural when God the Holy Spirit operates through a fallible, sinful human preacher to bring His elect to new life and true faith. That's supernatural, but that doesn't obviously count for a lot of people. And so unless a bolt strikes you and knocks you down and makes you roll on the floor, then it doesn't really count. But that's not how we look at it, and it's not how Olevianus looks at it here.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
He goes on to say, a believing heart should remember that it is the Lord who inclines the minds of these people toward you. And it is He who has given and continues, now listen to that, and continues to give other created things their power, so that they serve as instruments of His goodness and mercy toward me. And he cites Jeremiah 5, Acts 3, and Acts 14. Right? This is true, he says, to such an extent that we do not drink even a drop of water that is not a kindness of God. So all these things are gifts from God. So when He sends people into your life that help you, that's a gift from God. It doesn't have to be immediate. In fact, I was so critical of this quest for an immediate religious experience that I developed a category for it. And I discussed this in Recovering the Reformed Confession. I talked about the quest for illegitimate religious experience. And then I have another category, the quest for illegitimate religious certainty. And these are both ways of getting around means in different ways, but they're both ways of getting around means. But as we understand the faith, as we confess it, as we explain it, as Olevianus explains it, God uses means, and these means are not to be despised. They are, as he says, a kindness of God. Question 40, what is the second benefit? And the answer is patience, which this doctrine provides us in all adverse circumstances in life in general, but especially in the persecutions suffered for the truth of the gospel. When Olevianus published Firm Foundation, European Christians were actually suffering and dying for the gospel. Now, think of this. Beginning about the same year that Firm Foundation appeared, the Spanish king, also the Holy Roman Emperor, same fellow, two offices, right? Having a state church is so much fun.
Sabotucci's, column fives, spies, victim of circumstance. Truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah. So much fun, you theocrats. I really, really wish you'd read some history. I mean, real history, not the stuff that's being passed off as history among the Christian nationalists or the theonomists or reconstructionists, but actual, credible history, not the sort of magical histories about, sanitized histories that are, frankly, just not very serious. For example, just think about George Washington, right? If you understand the state of Anglicanism in the early 18th century and through the 18th century, and then you place Washington in that context, right? His rather vague language about God, which some have tried to sort of by jujitsu make him into a robust confessional reformed or confessional evangelical of some kind, makes a lot more sense if you have a category for latitudinarianism. And if you have some idea of what's happening in Anglican theology, piety, and practice in the 18th century, particularly the late 18th century. So that's what I mean as real history, putting people in their actual historical context and reading their words in their actual historical context. Same thing, too, with Bonhoeffer, right? There are attempts to make Bonhoeffer into this sort of evangelical, Bible-believing evangelical Christian, resisting tyranny on the basis of his biblical and evangelical convictions. And as I keep telling people, as I've been telling students for decades now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't attend Moody or even Wheaton. He attended, I think he went to University, if memory serves, in Berlin. So he graduated and studied in a completely different environment. And his theology is very, very different from that of Orthodox evangelicalism. I'm not saying Bonhoeffer's not a hero, but I'm just saying we have to treat him historically. We have to let Bonhoeffer be Bonhoeffer, or Bonhoeffer, if you prefer. That's what I mean. That's a couple of examples of real history as opposed to sort of mythological stories that we tell each other. One more example, just because I know people, well, what do you mean, Clark? Well, I know you're thinking that. I know. I'm trying not to get too far astray here. But, I would contrast Harry Stout's account of George Whitefield with Arnold Dallamore's. And I find Stout's account of Whitefield much more historical, much better grounded in actual history, much less mythological, much less hagiographic. And I was impressed by the fact that when Dallamore reviewed Stout's book on Whitefield, that all he could do, really, instead of making arguments, all he could do was sputter. And I thought that was striking, because if Stout's book was as bad and as incorrect as Dallamore alleged, it should have been pretty easy to show. But in his review, he didn't really show anything. All he did was sputter. So there's a difference between hagiography and history. That's what I'm up to. Anyway, so when Olevianus published Firm Foundation, as I was saying, right, European Christians were actually suffering and dying for the gospel. And the Spanish king, the Spanish emperor, right, theocracy is so much fun, as I was saying, was so determined to destroy all the Protestants in the Netherlands that he murdered thousands of them. And I've heard estimates or read estimates as high as 12,000. Again, we don't know, but it was a lot. And Spain went to war with the Netherlands over religion, and the crown, the Spanish crown, bankrupted Spain 3 times in his effort to destroy the Reformation there. And Spain and the Netherlands, as any Dutchman will tell you, were at war for 80 years over this. In France, the Roman Catholic crown murdered tens of thousands of Reformed Christians during the French wars of religion. And, maybe as many, we don't really know exactly, but somewhere between 10 and 30,000 French Reformed Christians were killed in 1 week during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which obviously wasn't just one day. It began on St. Bartholomew's Day, but it continued for a week, and some people would say for weeks after that. And so that's why estimates vary. It depends on what they're counting and when they say the episode ended and so forth. And they're all estimates. Nobody really knows. But it was a significant number of people in a very short period of time. Some of Olevianus's schoolmates suffered for the gospel in France and in other places. Remember, Geneva sent graduates, lots of graduates, back to France, and many of them died for the gospel. The author of the Belgic Confession, Guy de Bray, was martyred for the gospel in Antwerp in 1567. So when he talks about suffering for the gospel, he's not talking through his hat. He's talking about things that are going on, right then at that very moment, and actually are going to get worse after he published this book. Not because he published the book, but afterwards it's going to get even worse. American Christians then talk about suffering for the gospel, and there has been increased pressure on Christians. I recognize that, and Christians, I think, have faced, lawsuits. That seems to be true for their faith. People, think about the florist in Washington who was put out of business for her convictions. And that poor baker in Colorado who's been sued repeatedly, and they're just making an example of him. They're harassing him in order to get him to do what they want and to make a point, and he keeps winning in court, but it is expensive. It is exhausting. So there's a kind of lawfare, I believe that's true, against some Christians in some cases, but we're not really facing any kind of persecution like they faced in the 16th century, anything like the Scottish Covenanters faced, or the French Reformed, the Huguenots faced, or the Dutch Reformed faced. Now, there are Christians across the globe who are suffering real persecution. Talk to Christians in Arab nations. Talk to Christians who live in the various African nations. I think, for example, of Nigeria, where there's a substantial Reformed population, about 1 million Reformed Christians, and where Christians there of various sorts are being murdered by Islamists. And that's actually happening. That's real persecution. Obviously, we could talk about Christians, living underground, as it were, or, conducting their faith, practicing their faith underground in North Korea. When Korea was divided up, the Presbyterians were allotted the North. This is before the war. And then during the war, the course of the war, some of them were able to get south, but some of them weren't, and they were trapped above the 38th parallel. And there are still Christians in North Korea, and it's extremely difficult because that's a highly ideological and repressive regime. Christians in China, obviously, are suffering, and it's becoming more difficult. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to create any problems, but it's certainly a matter for prayer. So Christians are suffering in other places as well, and we could make a long list. So we ought to pray for those folks. But when Olevianus talks about being comforted by the doctrine of providence, especially as he says in the persecution suffered for the truth of the gospel, knowing the doctrine of providence blesses us, enables us to endure. And he goes on to explain that in question 41. How do we receive patience from this doctrine in life in general? So beyond persecution, but just in general. In this way, what makes us impatient is that we concentrate, and this is very wise pastoral advice. Right? He's fairly young when he wrote this book, but this is very wise. He's about 30 years old or so. What makes us impatient is that we concentrate on the created things that oppress us rather than on God, even though it is really He who does all of these things. And we talked about this last time. And He is our Father, not our enemy. Let me say that again. Right? We concentrate, he says, on the created things that oppress us rather than on God, even though it is really He who does all these things. And He is our Father, not our enemy. That's huge when we really need to embrace that. We need to take that to heart. We need to believe it. We need to accept it. And it's a hard thing to accept, but it's the only way forward And something you need to learn before, as I said last time, you get the bad news. Because if you live long enough, you're going to get bad news. That's just the way it is. That's the nature of life in this world until Jesus comes. The postmillennialists are wrong. There's no golden age coming. We're not in one, at least not in the way that they think. And there's not going to be one before Jesus comes. We are pilgrims, according to 1 Peter. Right? If there was ever a book that you can't reconcile with postmillennialism, it's 1 Peter and 2 Peter, and really most of the New Testament. There's no golden age in the New Testament. That's a theory that they know before they ever get to the New Testament, and basically they just ignore the New Testament. But 1 Peter says explicitly, we are strangers and aliens. We are pilgrims. And of course, the book of Hebrews tells us that we are pilgrims. And that's one of the major points of chapter 11. And there's no idea of conquering, no idea of taking back anything, no idea of an earthly glory age before Jesus returns. One of the grave weaknesses of the postmillennial theory is its utter lack of evidence in the New Testament. And if you think I'm being harsh, then you're probably not aware of the standard amillennial criticism of postmillennialism. But I fixed that for you. It's at heidelblog.net/postmillennialism. heidelblog.net/postmillennialism.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Heidelcast.
Oh, it's all there. Go listen to those things and then come back and tell me. And you listen to Bavinck, and you listen to Voss, and listen to Strimple and Hoekema, and all the other folks that I recorded for you so that you didn't have to read. You just have to listen on your drive, whatever you're doing, so you could hear these critiques and then come back and explain how you're going to rescue postmillennialism from those, I think, really devastating criticisms. So, Olevianus, who was an amillennialist, by the way, that's what we would call him today. By the way, a lot of people in the 16th and 17th, just about everybody in the 16th century is an amillennialist, and I can prove that pretty easily. Just look at the Augsburg Confession, and that stands for the Lutherans, where they reject postmillennialism. And then listen to this paragraph from the Second Helvetic Confession, written by Heinrich Bullinger in 1561 and published in 1566, where he wrote, and the Swiss Reformed churches signed on to this, quoting now, "Moreover, we condemn the Jewish dreams that before the day of judgment there shall be a golden age in the earth, and that the godly shall possess the kingdoms of the world, their wicked enemies being trodden underfoot. For, or because, the evangelical truth and the apostolic doctrine," and he cites Matthew 24 and 25 and Luke 21, and he cites 2 Thessalonians 2 and 2 Timothy 3 and 4, "are found to teach far otherwise." Right? We condemn the Jewish dreams that before the day of judgment there shall be a golden age on the earth. So that's how the Reformed talked about what we know today as postmillennialism. And the Jewish dreams that were being promulgated, obviously were promulgated by some Jews, but they were also being picked up by Anabaptists. So that's probably where they were, actually most directly confronting that ideology. And Calvin, in the 16th century denounced this idea of golden dreams, Jewish golden dreams, eschatological expectations of a golden age. Now, were there some postmillennialists in the 17th century? Sure. Were they all postmillennialists, as has been sometimes alleged? Well, no, not at all. There were chiliasts, that is, premillennialists, historic premillennialists, not dispensational premillennialists. By the way, since I've gone this far astray, let me clear this up, right? All dispensationalists are premillennial, but not all premillennialists are dispensationalists. So people who appeal to historic premillennialism, chiliasm, which existed, from the very early 2nd century, as if that were some sort of precursor to dispensationalism, are barking up the wrong tree. That dog just won't hunt. You can be premillennial without being dispensational. And just because somebody's pre-mill doesn't mean they're sort of a proto-dispensationalist. So that's a silly argument. So they need to stop doing that. I just saw that here the other day. So, no golden age. And as I say, Olevianus is certainly an amillennialist. Calvin certainly in today's categories. Since about the early 1920s, right? That's when we developed the category amillennial. Lots of people whom we used to call postmillennial are really amillennial. B.B. Warfield, I think, would be one of those. People say, well, Warfield is a postmillennialist. Well, when he was writing, we didn't even have the category amillennial. So again, it's misleading. There's a little article on the Heidelberg, a brief note. I think I called it on the history of amillennial, the term amillennial. You can check that out. And you can check out the resource page on eschatology, heidelblog.net/eschatology. So again, going back to Olevianus, right, as we should. We need to focus not on the created things that oppress us, but on our Father, who is not our enemy. He is our friend, right? For what are, he says, what are the spiritual trials with which he tests our faith and patience? What are they? Now listen to this. But instruments by which he operates in the present. Again, what was I just talking about? About the way that in Reformed theology particularly, but in Reformation theology broadly, and even traditional Christian theology, God is said to operate through secondary causes, through created things to accomplish his purposes. But instruments by which he operates in the present, so that according to his promise, Romans 8:28 he's referring to, all things, the greatest affliction as well as the least, work together for good. That is why the believer who has come to know the doctrine of God's providence should not think too much about the created things that plague him. And we talked about this very thing last week, right? You get angry, you get depressed because you meditate on the people who did all those bad things to you. And you just sort of spiral, and you focus more and more and more on the secondary causes. And, it's clever to justify that by saying, well, God uses secondary means and secondary causes, and they're responsible for their actions. Well, that is true. But where's that getting you? That going around and round in your mind about these people who did these bad things to you. Where's that getting you? Except deeper and deeper into depression. So he says, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in this, right? Not think too much about the created things that plague him or get so caught up with that which causes him pain. The believer should rather lift up his mind to behold the fatherly hand of God that chastens us. Beholding his fatherly hand powerfully impresses upon our childlike hearts profound patience and meekness, of which Joseph, Genesis 45, Job, chapter 1, David, 2 Samuel 16, are beautiful examples.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
As you can hear, it's that time of year again, and I thought, well, who knows more about ringing bells except me? Well, okay, Clark. This is also a time of year when we need you to make the coffer clink, so that we can keep fulfilling our mission to help you recover the Reformed Confession and to help others discover it. Won't you make the coffer clink right now by clicking on the donate button, or send a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391. Escondido, California, 92027. And remember, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
Question 42. How do we receive patience from this doctrine in persecutions for the sake of the gospel? And let me stop here before I read the answer and talk about it. Notice the thing for which we're being persecuted. For the sake of the gospel, not for the sake of, a culture war, not for the sake of, any number of things for which people claim to be persecuted. The thing we're talking about here is being persecuted for the sake of the gospel, not even for the sake of the moral law. Caspar Olevianus was a solidly Reformed theologian, and one of the things that really animated his work was recovering the distinction between law and gospel. And for example, in his commentary on Romans, he said the whole book of Romans is about the distinction between law and gospel. And that if you read his commentary on Ephesians, he said the same thing about it too. So for Olevianus, at least two of the New Testament books are principally about the distinction between law and gospel. So again, don't let people tell you, well, that's a Lutheran thing. It's just simply not. No one ever accused Olevianus of being a Lutheran. The Lutherans were actually quite unhappy with Olevianus and quite critical of him, and yet they agreed solidly about this fundamental Reformation distinction between law and gospel. And so when he says gospel, he means it. He's not just tossing words around that don't mean anything in particular. No, it means something in particular. The gospel is good news about what Jesus has done. God the Son has become incarnate. And he is obeyed in our place. He's died in our place. He was raised for our justification. He's ascended. He's seated at the right hand of the Father. He's interceding for us. And he's coming again for us. Right? Those are all gospel words. And that's the thing for which, if we're going to be persecuted, that's the thing for which we ought to be persecuted. There are a lot of reasons why you could potentially be persecuted, and some of them are quite significant. You know, my heart really goes out to those people, for example, in the UK, and I think even in the US, who are, really devoted to protecting the lives of the unborn. Now, some of them have actually broken the law. I don't think it's an entirely just law, and it probably needs to be challenged in the courts. And, we need to have a debate about whether these are just laws, but people have been arrested for standing up for the lives of the unborn. And in the UK, I've seen the videos. It seems as if you're not even allowed to stand near an abortion clinic and think thoughts. You can't say a prayer in your mind. I've seen the video of the police officer asking this Christian if this person was praying in their mind and then arrested for it, which is crazy. I mean, it's Orwellian. And I saw just the other day, there's some concern in the UK that people need to be kept from reading Orwell, which I guess I'm not surprised. But, so that's all very dark stuff, very troubling stuff. And if you've been peacefully, giving witness and praying for the unborn and offering counsel, quietly, patiently, peacefully to people who are, contemplating taking the life of their child for whatever reason, and you get arrested for that, my heart goes out to you. And, I appreciate your courage and your boldness. And I'm a little less sympathetic for people who, break the law specifically, but, breaking into clinics and that sort of thing. I think that crosses a line. But what Olevianus is thinking about here is suffering for the sake of the good news. That was the thing for which the Apostle Paul was persecuted. That was the thing for which the Apostle Peter was arrested. That was the thing for which John, I think the Apostle John, was put on the Isle of Patmos. So, we want to be careful that the thing for which we get crosswise with the unbelieving world is the gospel of Christ. Acts 5:29, they were commanded, the apostles were commanded by the authorities to stop preaching the gospel. And they said, well, we can't do that. Right? We have to keep doing that. So if that brings us into conflict with the authorities, well, so be it. We're not revolutionaries. We're not trying to upend society, but we are commissioned by the ascended Lord Jesus to announce this message. And it was that thing for which the early Christians were punished. The Romans would ask them 3 times, are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? And if you said yes, you sealed your own death. You gave witness to the faith, and they demanded that we renounce Jesus and that we affirm Caesar as a god, and that we pour out an offering to demonstrate our loyalty to the Roman state religion. Again, it's so much fun having a state religion, isn't it? So, according to Olevianus, we receive comfort and patience from the doctrine of providence when we're persecuted for the sake of the gospel because, now this is his answer, the enemies of the gospel cannot think a single thought in their minds or hearts or even lift a finger to carry it out unless God supervises it and, at that moment, rules and operates in their hearts and minds to protect his Christians. So, this is a really, really important notion, and we'll get to this, but I just want to put it out on the table. The doctrine of concursus, or concurrence, we might say, but the Latin word is concursus. We'll come back to that, but that's a very important notion. And then he goes on to say, moreover, their persecutions cannot, and this is very, very important, cannot exceed the limits that have been established for them from eternity. God has actually decided and determined how far such persecution should go. As the apostles said through the Holy Spirit in the midst of persecution, truly against your holy child Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. That's Acts 4:27 and 28. And then he cites John 7:30 and 8:20. So here, clearly, you have Scripture saying that those people, Pontius Pilate and Herod, only did what God's hand and purpose determined before to be done. So they can't do anything that God hasn't purposed for them to be done. And therefore, it's not with them that we have to do ultimately. It's with God, which is what Olevianus has been saying. So first thing I want to say about this is that we need to speak carefully about this matter. And I appreciate very much that Olevianus does. He speaks very carefully about this. So, the temptation is to put all the attention on the secondary causes. And then sometimes, the other mistake to be made here is that people so focus on God that they ignore the second causes altogether. So it's true that Pontius Pilate is morally responsible for what he did in the crucifixion of Jesus. That is true. But it's also true that he only did what God foreordained for him to do. Both things are true. We have to say both things. And it's one reason why Pilate is memorialized in the Apostles' Creed. I mean, obviously he's in the Bible, but we recite his name whenever we say the Creed, and some of us say the Creed just about every week, as a reminder of the fact that real human beings in real time, real space, really did horrible things, including the murder of Jesus of Nazareth, right? So that's a reality. But Herod only did, and the Gentiles and the people of Israel, they only did what God's hand and purpose determined beforehand to be done. So then this gets us back to that word I mentioned a moment ago, and that is concursus. And that's to say that God works in and through human beings and other created causes. God works in and through and along with other created causes. And these created causes, and we're thinking about human beings particularly, freely make choices. Now, those choices are comprehended in the divine providence, but within the providence of God, existentially, if you will, psychologically, as we experience things, experientially, we make free choices. You made a free choice to listen to this podcast. I hope, anyway. I hope nobody's forcing you, right, at gunpoint or something like that to listen to the podcast. I hope you're listening to it of your own, as we say, free will. Now, is your will so free that it's equally ultimate to God's? Well, no, that's absurdity because, well, that would be polytheism, and we're not pagans, right? We're Christians, so God is almighty and no creature is. So there's a hierarchy. Nevertheless, within that hierarchy, within the order, within God's providence, people do make real free choices. Now, free in what sense? Well, they're not free from the providence of God. They're not free from his sovereignty. Again, that would be absurd. But they are free insofar as they are not coerced. In other words, we experience a real freedom. I got out of bed today and made a decision of what I was going to eat for breakfast. Now, that was all in the providence of God, right? And I didn't know when I made breakfast what the providence of God was. After breakfast was made, then I knew what the providence of God had been. We don't know it ahead of time. That's the other trick here. People think that they can know the providence of God ahead of time. No, you can't know it. You know it after the fact. And so we don't sit around trying to guess, well, what is the providence of God or what will it be? We obey God. We do what he says, the way he says, when he says, and we leave the outcome to him. But nevertheless, these things are simultaneously true. We make real free choices, not free relative to God, but free relative to other created forces. And even if somebody, were to try to coerce you, you always still have a choice. I didn't say a good choice, but you do have a choice. You have a choice between doing what they want you to do or not doing what they want you to do and then suffering the consequences. That's an unhappy choice, but it is still a choice. And so there is a real sense in which choice exists, but it is encompassed within the providence of God. And then God operates through, without violating, if you will, the free choice of the people through whom he operates. They make those choices, but those choices are comprehended within the providence of God. And so that is something like, it's a thumbnail sketch of our doctrine of concursus. So the choices are real, but God's providence is real simultaneously. And he's not contingent on us. That's the other really important thing that we need to understand, right? We are contingent on him. And as long as you keep that order together that way, right, then you don't run into problems. It's when people start saying, well, God is contingent. He's depending on us, and he can't do anything until we do something, or he doesn't know what we're going to do, or those kinds of things. Well, then you start wandering into heterodoxy and even into heresy. All right, Olevianus continues. It was impossible for Herod, Pilate, and the Gentiles and the Jews to do anything more in tormenting Christ our head than the purpose and hand of God had predetermined from eternity. Now, just in case you weren't sure that Olevianus was a strong, sort of reformed, providential, predestinarian, Augustinian theologian, he certainly is. They couldn't have done anything more in torturing and tormenting Christ than God had predetermined from eternity. Similarly, it is impossible for the Pilates, the Herods, the Pharisees, and poor deluded people of our day to think about, let alone carry out, any more persecution of the members of Christ than the purpose and hand of God has decided beforehand. And so when he writes these words, he's writing in a context in which people he knows are actually at risk of being martyred for the sake of the gospel. So again, this is not theoretical when he writes these words. God, he says, has not decided anything that is not salutary, in one sense saving, beneficial, would be a broad sense, for us, as he has promised us in his word. Yes, even if we should die for his name's sake. Quoting here, it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. That's Paul, Philippians 1:29. Now, this has to follow from what was said before, for the conformity of the members of Christ to their head. First in suffering, then in glory. By the way, this is why I was talking about postmillennialism earlier. Notice how he thinks. First in suffering, then in glory. According to postmillennialism, it's glory and then glory. No, according to Scripture, according to Paul, according to Olevianus, it's suffering now, glory later. Not earthly glory, but eschatological glory, heavenly glory. Right? And he says, is grounded, this is Olevianus, is grounded in the eternal purpose of God, in which the suffering and glory of Christ himself is also grounded. And he cites Romans 8:28 and 29. Question 43. What is the third benefit? It is a good, quiet, and tranquil heart. Well, this is where we began the episode, isn't it? A gentle spirit with which a Christian henceforth expects everything from God's hand to be for the good. 4. Since our lives are surrounded by countless dangers that daily threaten us with death, our hearts will be rid of all anxiety, fear, and worry when the light of God's providence penetrates them by the grace of the Holy Spirit. By this light, the believer knows and is assured that he has been taken under the protection of God and is united with him, that the angels are commanded to look after him, that he is free from all creaturely harm and danger, and that no creaturely adversity can arise unless God, the ruler of everything, wills to send it, and then only so that it works for the believer's good. Now listen to this. This is the covenant that believers bound to God the Creator also have with creatures who without the Creator's will can neither live nor move. Although this doctrine contains still more fruits and benefits, the ones we've explained are the most important. We can truly say that to be ignorant of the providence of God leads to misery beyond measure. Knowledge of this doctrine, on the other hand, is the beginning of true happiness.
The story you have just heard was true. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent.
That's it for this episode of the Heidelcast. Join us next time as we continue our series,
The Comfort of the Covenant.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Email heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2024. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
This is the way.
All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey.
Let's be careful.
Good night, Chet.
Nothing is over until we decide it is.
Silence! I kill you!
I'm out of here!
We're a little late. Good night, folks.
Well, Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night, Mrs. Calabash. We're heavy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building.
It's the end of the program. Roy Knapp is at the chimes. Good night, all. We'll be with you tomorrow.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
adjusting the Wayback Machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
And we just might break our record high for today. That's 103 degrees at the Civic Center, set back in 1907. It's going to be sunny and hot, though, all the way through Sunday. Highs today, 90s downtown, 105 in the valleys, about 75 along the coast. Right now, 72 degrees. I'm Monica Brooks, and you're up to date now at 8 o'clock, Jay.
Right. It's a bustin' summer. Nobody else can hook you up with tickets to the hottest concert club, MTV's Power Jam, all right? Be the 26th call on the power lines now, and you're going to go with us.
Milli Vanilli and our freshest music at 8:01 at Power 106.
Of music power. Music power. KPWR Los Angeles. It's the Morning Zoo with Jay Thomas on Power 106.
Hi, and good morning. It's Power 106. It's 5 minutes after 8 o'clock, and who are you?
I'm Keith Nipschild.
Keith Nipschild?
Yeah.
Oh, what do you get? You get Club MTV tickets. You'll see Milli Vanilli, Tone Loc, Paula Abdul, so many more. You're lucky, I'll tell you that, at Power 106.
All right, Jay, how you doing?
Great. Power 106. David Bowie. It's 9 minutes after 8, 8:09. Hot again today. A little cooler, actually, in the 90s in Los Angeles. Am I doing this correctly, Monica?
You look so stupid with that hat. That would be appreciated. There you go.
All right. Sunny and cooler if you call 95. 100 in the local valleys, 108 out there in the inland valleys. Who lives there? Like tarantulas and like
I do.
Lizards? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, anyway. 75 at the beaches, 72 degrees right now. And what else? Time for our thought of the day at almost 10 after 8 o'clock. Life without death, Monica, would be like a freeway with no off-ramps. Thank you for that late laughter. There we go.
39 City, 45 Highway. Your mileage may vary. Drive responsibly. Maybe I'll order a pizza for lunch.
Amazing.
No pepperoni.
Test drive the new Swift GA at your Southern California Suzuki dealer today.
Power 106, good morning. 12 minutes after 8 o'clock. This is the Morning Zoo, and it's time now for Criminal of the Day, and we found someone smart enough to sponsor it. Yes, brought to you by Lowenbrow, the Lion's Brew. All together now. Thanks. All right. You know that there's somebody that works in the State Motor Vehicles Department, and their job, or their jobs, there's a lot of folks, to look over these vanity license plates to make sure that nobody gets a dirty or bad word.
Oh, yeah.
Or some funky numbers through there. Well, at 13 after 8 o'clock, Bill and Donna Brewster of Santa Ana are going to sue the state of California because they've been forced to return their vanity license plate because it was obscene, and the word was petard. 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 The State Motor Vehicles Division demanded the plates back, saying that petard is an old French slang for human rear exhaust. That's what the state says. The Brewsters of Santa Ana maintain it's the bureaucrats who are full of hot air. They brought in a dictionary which says that petard these days means an explosive device used to blow an opening in a wall. And, of course, they won their case. I want Buona Bob. Yes. I want the word of the day to be petard.
You got it.
I want you to get in there.
I will.
Look up petard, Buona Bob.
Okay.
We will take a very close look. This is just like the courts are doing
Why would
now.
they want petard on their license plate anyway?
Because it probably means rear exhaust. That's why. Are you kidding? It's 14 minutes after 8 o'clock, 8:14. This is Power 106.
You got through this bit without doing any sound effects.
We got through this bit without actually saying anything funny. And Lowenbrow sponsored it at the power station.
I'm stopping now.
The best podcast, the Heidelberg